got in training, needed to do this video. It's been a long time coming. When are you going to do a compare Scotland to Singapore video? It's finally arrived. This time on Scotney Dot. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome. My name is Mark. I'll be your host for this match, and it's taking place over 10 subjects of my choosing, purely for entertainment purposes and not supposed to start some kind of flame war in the comments, okay? Play nice. Round 1. Transport. Now, first of all, in Singapore, public transport, the trains and buses are kind of interlinked with the card system, similar to what London uses as an Oyster card. Here we call it EasyLink though. The transport system is effective, it's clean, it's fast, and it's cheap. Yes, Singapore, I said it's cheap. Wait till I tell you about what Scotland has to deal with. Scotland's transport system is not government run. It was sold off in the 1980s by the Conservative Party of the time in government, led by one Mrs. Margaret Thatcher. She saw fit to sell off everything that the government owned at the time, not just buses and trains, British Rail as it was known back then, also things like BP, British Telecom, which used to be government run as part of the post office back then, and many other of government wings becoming companies. Now, I've heard a lot of talk in Singapore about privatising the transport system. I only have one thought of that since the 1980s when it happened in the UK, and that is don't. If Singapore transport system becomes privatised, becomes a business, run like a business, you're going to end up like Scotland. It's not cheap, it's not efficient, it's not clean, and it's just an absolute mess. There are some services that don't even run even when they're timetabled to, because maybe they couldn't have a driver at the time or whatever, or just it's cheaper not to run it sometimes without telling the public or without making immediate changes to the timetable. The system in Scotland is a mess. In Singapore, if I go from my home on the outskirts of Singapore into town, it costs me roughly $1.76 on the EasyLink card, which in British pounds is about £1. Cool, isn't it? If you're in Singapore, you're not going to agree that that's cool. But wait, if I'm in Scotland, they don't even do return journeys anymore on buses, and they don't do cards. What they do now is a day ticket, which is about £5, which roughly translates to almost $9 in Singapore money. That is $9 for 1 day's travel. So if you have to go to work, that's $45 a week in travel. Compare that with what you have to pay just now in Singapore. And I'm sure you'll agree that the only winner of the transport round for this event is Majulah Singapura. Next up, round 2. We have diet. Singaporeans love their food. There's no doubting that. And with Singapore being a literal hub of Southeast Asia, all flights come in from all directions, you can pretty much get any food you can dream of in Singapore. In Scotland, however, the national cuisine tends to be deep fried, tends to be processed meats as well. So the diet you end up with in Scotland, the diet I certainly ended up with in Scotland, is very heavy, greasy, stodgy. It lies heavy, makes you feel bloaty and full, but isn't exactly nutritionally guaranteed. The good thing about Scotland is vegetables are cheap if you're from Singapore. If you're from Scotland, vegetables are still expensive. Compared to the cost of living in Scotland, vegetables are still expensive. So healthy eating is about as much of an option as it is if you're buying groceries in Singapore. Vegetables are incredibly expensive in Singapore because literally Singapore imports everything. That is changing though. Singapore are leading the way in vertical farming, building up farms vertically on wall surfaces to grow plants in temperate climates and things, to have vertical farms. Vertical farming, I've mentioned that before in the Changi video, I'm sure, Changi Joe. So, Singapore leads the way in vertical farming, and because of that, the vegetables that are beginning to be produced from that, they're becoming cheaper in Singapore, and that can only be a good thing. So when it comes down to diet, there's only one winner. Majulah Singapura. Round 3. Wage inequality. Now this was a tricky one because the wage inequality in Scotland or Singapore is roughly the same. You still get gaps. There are still people at the lowest end of society that still manage to eke out a living somehow. And then there's people who are in jobs as well, and then there's the super wealthy. And there doesn't seem to be too much in between. And in Scotland that's pretty similar too, although there's probably a bit more degrees of variation in between. I was stuck to choose one for this, who would be best for wage inequality. And the only way I could come up with something is by asking myself, if I was completely broke, where would I rather live, in Scotland or Singapore? And the only thing I could think of was, "O flower of Scotland." Round 4, government. Now this one's another tricky one because both governments are actually quite young. Singapore's government came into being, was it 57 years ago, I think? Singapore's independence is only 55 years old, but the government had been going a couple of years before that. Singapore's government is still in its infancy, and that was shown by the recent general election in July, where the sitting government, the People's Action Party, managed to lose one of their constituencies called the GRC, Group Representative Council, where 5 MPs sat on it, and they lost those 5 MPs to an opposing party. Now here's the thing, the general election was strange to me because you've got the controlling party, People's Action Party, and you've got about a dozen other political parties, and none of them offer the same amount of candidates as the ruling party do, so none of them can ever win power. I know, right? They could maybe form a coalition of parties and have the PAP in opposition, but the way things stand, as it is with the political system in Singapore in its infancy, the People's Action Party are virtually guaranteed a win every single time. People's Action Party pretty much run all the TV and newspapers in Singapore, so in run up to election time, or even the announcement of the election, there was more media spotlight on government ministers. That's something I noticed anyway. I don't know if you did, but it's something I noticed. Anyway, in Scotland had a devolved parliament. Now for those of you in Singapore who don't know what that is, the Westminster government in London of the United Kingdom still has the final say on certain issues like national security or defence, big issues like that. Whereas all other powers are devolved to a parliament that sits in Holyrood in Edinburgh, and it's headed by the Scottish National Party, led by Nicola Sturgeon. Me mentioning any of these people doesn't say I'm affiliated with any of them, because I'm not. I'm just telling you how the two governments work. The devolved parliament in Scotland came into being in 1997, I believe. Or at least it was voted for in 1997. It might not have come in until 1999, I can't remember. I'm getting old, sorry. Even though the Scotland's Parliament is younger than the Singapore one, it already had parliamentarians who served in Westminster, so already had an equal share of party representation. Now, the good thing about Scotland's government is that it's voted in by using the single transferable vote system, which is a proportional representation system. You get your ballot paper, you have the parties or candidates all listed there, and you can choose 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 in order of preference, and your votes, your second vote, third vote, fourth vote will still count. You don't have to vote them all. You can just do one for your favourite one and leave it at that, no more. You can do that. It's up to you. It's proportional, so it's a more equal, fair way of representing it. Also, how the parliament sits actually affects things subconsciously as well. In Singapore, you have a model based on Westminster, which sees the ruling party on one side of the screen. It'll be your side, my right at the moment looking at the camera, and your left. So you've got the ruling party on one side, the opposition parties and candidates taking up the other side. And it's very like Westminster. You've got the government in charge of the day. At the moment it's Conservatives led by Boris Johnson. And on the other side you've got, others. That system, I find, the kind of first past the post system that the Singapore Parliament's modelled on, it's very combative subconsciously, as in one party makes decisions, one party or other people oppose decisions. You've probably seen the British Parliament on TV before it gets televised. You may have seen some clips from it. It can get rather raucous in a very polite way. The right honourable gentleman is talking rubbish, blah blah blah. That's about as scandalous as it gets in Parliament. Whereas in Scotland, the way the Parliament sits in Holyrood is it's a semicircle, an open semicircle, where most of the seats are taken up by the ruling party and the rest of the seats are taken up by others who won seats are one enough for the vote, rather, and they can all actually address and see one another equally to their sides rather than opposite one another. And at the open bit of the semicircle is the speakers panel, so that tends to enhance the feeling of more collaborative politics. You don't get quite so much direct opposition, direct argument, direct debate. It's more collaborative. It's more, well, okay, let's take this idea on board and let's see how we can refine it to make it better. And that's a good thing. That can only be a good thing. In terms of government, there's only one winner for me.
O flower of Scotland.
Round 5. Immigration. Hey, just talked about governments, so may as well stay political, huh? Right, immigration. Both countries actually have very similar views on immigration. They're very aware of how open both countries need to be to bring in immigrants. We need to encourage immigrants to come to the country to help our economy. Both countries have tensions just underlying the surface from, shall we say, a certain breed of people who may not understand all the issues at stake. I'm trying not to use the word ignorant, but there are people like that in both Scotland and Singapore who tend to view their own communities first, shall we say. That's all I'm going to say about that. Because if I say any more, I might get into trouble with the Singapore government. Immigration. Yeah, it's a tough one. It's a real tough one. I've researched and I've looked at lots of facts and figures, and honestly I can't decide on this one. So for this category, it's going to be a tie. Round 6. Climate. Now, I bet you're probably sitting there wondering, what the hell is Mark doing wearing a fucking vest top? Well, apart from the boxing metaphor at the start, one of the reasons I wanted to talk about climate is because this is a very subjective category and it's not really a fair one to compare from my point of view anyway. Because if you're in Scotland and you're used to 4 seasons and horrible wet winters and things, cold, wet winters, then you're going to look at Singapore and you're going to think, that's a nice climate. Whereas if you're in Singapore and you look towards the temperatures in Europe that you see when the weather report is on, you'll think, gosh, that seems a much nicer temperature to actually live in. I don't have to use my aircon on full blast all the time or switch the ceiling fans on. As you can see, probably see slight tan on my forearms, and you probably see a tan line on my neck. That's the colour I'm meant to be, and that's the colour I've gone. So if you're Singaporean, you're going to prefer European temperatures. If you're European, you're going to prefer Singapore temperatures. Me being Scottish, there's only one winner for that.
Singapore.
Round 7. Culture and lifestyle. Now, this is an interesting one. In terms of culture and lifestyle, I'm also going to think about nightlife, arts, entertainment, music, that kind of thing. So what people do for socialising. Now, in Singapore, because Singaporeans are normally considered quite a serious and studious people, there's not actually a lot, once you get into adulthood, to actually do in Singapore. I'm sorry to say. There's literally just cinema. There's very few concerts. Very few larger bands play in Singapore when they do Asian tours. And that's a shame. And a lot of it has to do with the restrictions that the government imposes on concerts for curfews, noise levels, things like that. Also, if your lyrics happen to be even moderately offensive, potentially to religions, your concert could be banned. This happened a couple of years ago to a band called Watain. I think that's how you pronounce them. If I didn't pronounce them correctly, I'm really sorry. Watain, kind of black metal, death metal band. So, Malu. Obviously, I quite like metal myself, so I was quite interested to know that a metal band was coming to Singapore. The day before their concert was due to take place, it was cancelled due to concerns that song lyrics may offend certain religions, which actually is an offence here. If I say anything that could be even moderately considered to be potentially offensive to a religion, I could be in a lot of trouble. So Watain had to cancel their concert, but to give kudos to the band themselves, what they actually did, because they were already in Singapore when the decision came through that their concert had been cancelled, what they did was they showed up at the venue anyway, outside the venue, where their fans were going to be at the time of the concert. And what they did was a kind of meet and greet event, meeting the fans, signing t-shirts or album covers for them, things like that, and had a really nice time. Even though Singapore does have strict laws against conglomerating in public. They managed to get away with it because it was all good-natured and all very nice. Well done to Watain. In Scotland, however, when you're talking about culture, lifestyle, arts, entertainment, nightlife, it's so much better. There's so much more to do in Scotland than in Singapore. I could go out in Glasgow at any day of the week before COVID, obviously. It didn't matter if it was a Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, whatever, right? I could go out any day of the week, go into a licensed venue that plays live music, and I could catch a band any night I want. And they were original bands. In Singapore, there's so many covers bands. So many covers bands. So many. I started to think Hotel California and Take Me Home Country Roads were sub-national anthems of Singapore. But yeah, I'm sorry to say, but Singapore, in terms of nightlife and culture and lifestyle, can be a little sterile at times. And it's no wonder that people want to get out of Singapore for a weekend to Indonesia or Malaysia, Johor, Baru or whatever, just to change the scenery basically, just to get out and just to relax a bit more. It makes sense to me because Singapore, in terms of physical geography, Singapore is only slightly larger than Glasgow. Now, if you're Scottish and you know Glasgow, right? If you can imagine the rough shape of Greater Glasgow, remember Greater Glasgow, remember that? If you imagine the boundary of Greater Glasgow and you extend it west to Dumbarton and east to the likes of Airdrie and Coatbridge, extend it north to take in Kilsyth and Kirkintilloch, maybe a little bit of Cumbernauld, and extend it south to take in the likes of East Kilbride and Hamilton, Lesmahago, Lanark. That's roughly the size of Singapore, but Singapore has the same population as Scotland, crammed into that small space. So you think, why isn't there more to do? You know, that's why it's a bit sterile. Because the populace is seen as studious and serious-minded. It doesn't leave much room for anyone else who comes to Singapore to work or live, who isn't perhaps so studious and serious-minded, like me. So in that sense, culture and lifestyle has to go to
Scotland.
Round 8. Things are getting tense. This is the cost of living. The cost of living of both countries. As I mentioned earlier with the wage gap, it's roughly very similar in terms of gaps. However, the minimum for those gaps is a lot higher in Singapore than it is in Scotland. If I come from Scotland, as I did, and come to Singapore, I think Singapore's really expensive. If you're used to paying for things in Singapore and you go to Scotland, you'll find Scotland really cheap. In that sense, for cost of living, I have to give it to Scotland, sorry.
Scotland.
Round 9, digital infrastructure. This is an interesting one, and I wanted to analyse how digital ready Scotland was compared to Singapore, especially during the global pandemic. Lots of businesses, specifically restaurants as well, have had to move their business online and become online stores to still keep money coming in and still keep serving customers, whereas some businesses didn't manage to do that and have fallen by the wayside already. Now, in terms of being digitally ready for that, on the whole, in general, I think that Singapore has been more successful in converting stores to online only rather than Scotland has. I know from experiences keeping up with the news in both Singapore and Scotland that there's a lot more Scottish businesses that have essentially disappeared, that will not return once COVID goes away, because the amount of time in lockdown just essentially killed the business. In terms of being digitally ready for doing that, I have to give this round.
Singapore.
Right, so with immigration being a tie, that means the scores are tied and there's one more round to go. Without further ado, round 10. Housing. Now again, this was a tough one. And I'm going to tell you why. You see, the ubiquitous housing, the iconic housing, whether you live in Scotland or Singapore, is very similar in terms of community spirit, in terms of community relations, in terms of even the essential character that the housing has. In Scotland, these houses are known as tenements, and in Singapore, it's their HDBs, which stands for Housing Development Block. Now, both of these types of housing were built by the government. Tenements in the late Victorian times, and HDBs far more recently. Now here's the thing, if you're British and you're looking at HDBs and condos, you're probably thinking, why is Singapore building so many tower blocks? Living in a tower block is really crap. Britain gave the world tower block living, high-rise living, but Britain got it wrong. What happened in Britain was tower blocks became vilified for being shoebox ghettos, for being dens of drug dealing and crime ridden and vandalism and just general horribleness that just encapsulates everything bad about high-rise living. Singapore, on the other hand, have done amazing work with tower blocks and high-rise living. Take things like the Pinnacle, which has a mezzanine floor and a rooftop floor with cycle tracks and running tracks on it. It's got shops in it as well. You can have floors where you have just shops. They didn't even do that in Britain. Britain got it wrong. It'd be unfair of me to compare Singapore tower blocks with Scottish tower blocks because Singapore would win, but both tenements and HDBs are both iconic, both very particular to the countries they're from, and both have similar positive characteristics and vibes for varying reasons. So I can't decide. It's going to be a tie. Sorry if you think that's a cop-out, sorry. Did you honestly think I was going to cause some kind of diplomatic incident by choosing one over the other? Of course not. But we've had 10 rounds and it's tied, 6 each. We need a tie break, and this is where you come in. It doesn't matter if you're from Scotland or from Singapore. If you are from Singapore and you love bits of Scotland, like the scenery, which is a cheap shot because Singapore doesn't have much scenery because it's too small. If you are Scottish and you love things about Singapore, including Marina Bay Sands because Scotland doesn't have one, that's a cheap shot. But I want you to tell me in the comments what you think I should be comparing in a rematch video. What are the subjects I should cover? What would you like to know about between Scotland and Singapore? Even if you're not from Scotland or Singapore, what interests you in finding out more about Scotland and Singapore, the differences between the two? Let me know in the comments below, and with a bit of luck, I'll make a rematch video. If you liked this video, be sure to give me a thumbs up. If you didn't like it, give me a thumbs down, because it still counts anyway as interaction. If you loved what you saw, be sure to subscribe, and if you hated every minute of this, even the cop-out ending, then please ring a ding-dong, that gosh darn bell, to make sure you hate the next one too. And until the next one, Scotland daughters and sons, see you then.